Hello everybody, I'm Catherine Croft and I'm the Director of 20th Century Society. I'm here to welcome you and in a moment to introduce our speaker. But before we do that, I just want to explain to anyone who's not already a 20th Century Society member what it is that we're all about. So we're the National Preservation Organisation for buildings from 1914 onwards, and we have a role in the planning system, and we fight really hard to preserve the best buildings of the last 100 years. So we're a membership organisation, and normally we are out and about doing real life events and tours. Obviously with COVID, we have had to adapt, and so we're doing these Zoom talks instead. But we are asking if you possibly could donate to support our casework. We'd be very, very grateful, because normally our real life events make a major contribution to our campaigning work. So I also just want to say, sorry, losing my voice, very briefly, that we have we have a super rich week of talks coming up. Normally we're just doing these on a Thursday, but we have a talk on Sunday, which is Valeria from the RIBA photography collection, who you probably, some of you will have heard talking about her collection nationally a few weeks ago. Our Southwest group have persuaded her to do a specific talk about buildings in the Southwest, as seen in her photographs, so that sounds fun. And then on Tuesday, we have got Josh Mardell, who we basically had a complete failure of Zoom a couple of weeks ago. And we had to abandon Josh's lecture on Pat Crook and John Turner. And we've rescheduled it for this Tuesday. So if you're interested in either of those, you would be very welcome. So to what you've actually come for, our speaker tonight is Dominic Wilkinson, and he is both a practicing architect and he teaches at the John Moores University in Liverpool. And he's going to talk about Velarde. And Velarde is an architect who was principally a church architect and principally a Roman Catholic church architect. And many of his best buildings are in Liverpool or on the Wirral. So it's perhaps not totally surprising that Dominic should be a fan and have been able to do the research needed to produce a volume on Velarde in our C20 Architects Live series. And that's coming out at the end of the month, so any day now. I'll put some details up because there's a special offer going. You can order it from Liverpool University Press with 25% off, and I'll put that in the chat. And we also may have Andrew Crompton, who's Dominic's co-host.
I'm here.
Co-author. You are there. Oh, lovely. Hello. Hello. I gather you might chip in at various points.
I can answer questions, yes.
Yes, good. Okay, well, lovely to have you, because it's been a joint effort, the book. And I'm absolutely delighted that we've got a book on Velarde. I mean, part of the point of doing this series is to give increased stature and recognition to architects whose buildings that we're campaigning to keep. But it's also to encourage people to go out and look at them and enjoy them. And in the case of church architects, I think very much to help and encourage congregations to appreciate the buildings that they're in. So it's a real pleasure to welcome the book. I'm sorry we're not having a live party at the moment for obvious reasons, but we have got a beautifully illustrated talk by the two world experts on Velarde. So over to you.
Thank you, Catherine, and good evening, everyone. Obviously, it's disappointing to have to be doing these things via Zoom in one way, but actually it also broadens perhaps the opportunities. I'm hoping that there's some friends from America who may well be watching today, and certainly they wouldn't have been able to attend if we were doing it as a in situ event. So there are benefits to Zoom. So welcome everyone, and just to start with, how did I get to write about Velarde with Andrew? Well, way before I'd even heard of Velarde, when I was an architecture student, I came up to Liverpool to do my part 2, and I'd been here a couple of weeks, and I was on one of the staircases in Abercrombie Square, and this sort of rather formidable little rotund lady came up to me and said, "Velarde, do you know who he is?" I was like, no. I'm a part 2 student. I know about Liverpool. I know about Colin Rowe. I know about James Sterling. Never heard of Velarde. And I didn't think anything more of that until actually I started writing the book with Andrew. And there's the lady in question was someone called Janet Nospelius, who I will mention later in the talk, and who worked for Velarde for a number of years. And she has an interesting backstory, but we'll get to that later. So that was forgotten for a long time. And then I went to do a talk on a church that I know quite well, and driving past it, I live on the Wirral these days, and St Michael All Angels on the Woodchurch estate, which is this amazing aluminium-clad pyramid, listed, Grade 2 listed. Very beautiful church, a very hardcore modernist church designed by Richard O'Marney, but when he was at the F X Velarde partnership, and did a talk on that at a conference in London in 2011. And then Elaine Harwood from the C20 Society said, oh, if you're interested in Velarde, do you want to write a book? And that's where it started. So I spoke to Andrew. Andrew has a great deal more experience at writing books than I did. And I needed the discipline of working with someone. And so that's how we got started. And little did we know at the time what a detective exercise it would be. One of the problems we've had in doing this is that Velarde's archive was destroyed completely in 2006 in what can only be described as a house clearing accident. Andrew tracked down the relevant person and spoke to him, and he said, oh yeah, I threw all those drawings in a skip. So sadly, we had to start to piece together stuff. And I must say now that we're extremely grateful to Giles Velarde, who's F X Velarde's surviving son. And without him and his wife Celia's help, we really couldn't have put this together. So they filled in some gaps for us, particularly about Velarde the man. And then the rest was detective work, diving through archives, visiting churches, and coming across people who eventually would come out of the woodwork and said, oh, I worked with Velarde back in 1955 or something, and slowly piecing together the story. So it's taken quite a lot of time, much longer than we would have initially hoped to get to this point, but we're here now. So let's get started on with the body of the lecture. So here we go. That's a sorry, I need to. There we go. Now I'm starting off with a quote, and it's a quote from Charles Reilly, who was the head of school at Liverpool University when Velarde was a student, and who spotted Velarde and gave him offered him a place. And I'll read it out because it's quite a nice quote. Reilly had a very good way with words. I might have taken it as a fault in Velarde's church buildings that they are so personal in quality. I do indeed feel that they suffer from this limitation, that they are pieces of individual excellence rather than examples of a new school of thought. And I cannot honestly think of them inspiring imitators, using the word in its best sense, to successful emulation. Now, this is, I think this is a particularly observant comment by Reilly. Reilly was, in many ways, Velarde's surrogate father. Velarde's own father had died when he was 6. And although he had lots of brothers and sisters and very supportive brothers and sisters, obviously the absence of a father figure. And Reilly rather took him under his wing when he joined Liverpool University as a student, and would be his staunchest ally, an advocate until his own death. And what he's pointing out here, perhaps, is why Velarde is not better known and has not been better known, and really for a number of years was almost completely forgotten, except by the people who worked with him, obviously. And that is that his work is very personal in quality. And he's not setting an architectural style. He's not seeking to generate a new movement. He is producing, quietly getting on and producing buildings of individual excellence that, according to Reilly's words, will not inspire imitators, cannot inspire imitators even. So that's why we put this quote in. So there he is. There's Velarde as a young man in 1928 in Germany. So I'll start off just talking about him as a man, and then we'll go into the individual buildings in more detail after that. His father had come over from Latin America with a pot of money as a child, with a pot of money and a Panamanian nurse, and settled in England. They were billeted with the Rushton family, as in Willie Rushton, Rushton family in Cheshire, who were a good Catholic family. And Giulio Velarde, F X Velarde's father, married what was, to quote Giles, the prettiest daughter, and settled in the northwest. And there were 6 children, and FX was one of the middle ones. And he was described by his siblings as being the mutt of the family. His siblings were all very academic and very bright, and he was described as the mutt of the family, only good for drawing. And that is perhaps a clue to his character in there and his success. So I'll come back to the point about this Germany trip in a bit, but it's an important point. 1928 is an important point in his life. Just after he'd finished being a student, he was introduced to Madge Curran. He was introduced by her cousin, who was an architect based in the northwest, and she lived in Marlow in Buckinghamshire. And they met in 29 and married in 1930. And he had 2 sons, Julian, the eldest, who followed his father into architecture, and Giles, who became a very successful exhibition designer. And Giles, as I said, has been incredibly helpful in putting together the book. You probably can't quite make it out at the bottom of the slide there, but his feet are bandaged. He had been gassed in the First World War. He'd suffered from trench foot, which he never really fully recovered from. He suffered with ill health all his life, really, because in 1934 there was a bad car accident, and he was hit by a truck at a petrol station, which broke both his legs, and took him out of operation for a whole year. He only managed to keep going in his practice at that point because Charles Reilly offered to pay him his university part-time teaching salary as a loan in advance. And in 1940, he was given the last rites twice as he was suffering from bowel cancer, and he had a substantial amount of his bowel removed to recover from that. It's interesting reading his post-war diaries. They're full of references to food, so it obviously didn't affect his appetite very much. So he was always plagued by ill health, but that didn't seem to stop his career. So how did he get started as a practice? Well, I put this one in. This is one of his watercolours of Stokesay Castle in Shropshire from the late 1920s. This is probably from the early 1920s. He started off, after he was demobbed, after the armistice, he had no qualifications. He was a bit of a loose end. One of his brothers, Leo, paid for him to go to art school because he was good at drawing. So he went to art school in Liverpool, what was then called the Arts Sheds. And Professor Reilly spotted him there as a first-year student and thought he had a particularly good eye and he was the right sort of person. And Reilly encouraged him to join the architecture course at Liverpool University by offering him the opportunity to go straight into second year and offering him a bursary as well. So he obviously took that offer. The point being, though, that he came to architecture through art, not through any family connection with architecture and not through any earlier calling to be an architect. And I think this is something that you'll see in the way he approaches his architecture throughout his life. So he graduated from Liverpool University in 1924 and went to work initially with Wakeman and Bullen, who were at that point an established firm of architects in the city doing a lot of work for the Catholic Church. And they changed and became, very briefly, Wakeman, Bullen and Velarde. And they had this commission for St Matthew's Church in Clubmoor, which is a 1920s, 30s suburb on the original ring road around the city of Liverpool. In a rather undistinguished area of suburban housing, which is pretty flat, and a lot of fairly typical sort of radial roads, which all look very similar. There was a need for landmarks, and this quite prominent site was earmarked for Catholic Church. And Wakeman and Bullen were appointed, and Velarde was given the job in the office to do it. And I don't think his time there was particularly happy. He complained that he did all the design work and got paid very little for it, even though he was a partner. And subsequently, it was acknowledged that St Matthew's was his work. He did it all, although it was Wakeman and Bullen who were the practice. And before the job was finished, he left Wakeman and Bullen, and so the St Matthew's was completed by Velarde on his own. It's a fairly conventional 1920s sort of neo-Byzantine brick church. He didn't have the freedom of manoeuvre that he would have with his later buildings. And that's partly because it was paid for by something called the Honan bequest. And Honan had been an architect who was killed in the Somme, and he left a large sum of money to a number of causes, and in fact, Liverpool Architectural Society still award the Honan Travelling Scholarship, and have been awarding it since 1918, still awarded. And in fact, Velarde himself had won the Honan Travelling Scholarship. But he also left a sum of £12,000 in stocks and shares, which by the time the church came to be paid for, had risen to over £14,000. And that paid for the church. There was a stipulation that it be Byzantine in character, because Honan had worked before the war as an architect doing Byzantine churches in the northwest. So his hands were slightly tied. And also being the first project coming out of college, I'm sure he didn't have the confidence yet to fully break away from the sort of client's brief. You can see some of the things to note here in the nave are the low aisles with their semicircular brick arches on the left and right of the image. This low side aisle is something that he will discard for a while after this church, but then return to as motif. Brickwork, he loved brickwork. God, Velarde loved brickwork. And we'll see a lot of bricks in this lecture. And also the very ornate altar, playing off against the simple simplicity of the nave. And here's a bit more detail of the altar and one of the Stations of the Cross. And this integration of craft and art with his churches would be a constant theme through Velarde's work. And one of his great contributions is the quality of craftsmanship and artwork that's embedded within his buildings as an integral part of the buildings. Both the front of the altar and the Stations of the Cross here were carved by Herbert Tyson Smith. And Velarde would work with Herbert Tyson Smith and others, but Tyson Smith would be one of his preferred sculptors right through his life. The Stations of the Cross, the plaster maquettes for those, the full-size plaster maquettes for those, still exist, and they're in a friend's basement in Liverpool, so they're still there. Someone has asked if that Honan is related to the Honan Chapel in Cork. It is the same family. It is the same family. Yes, they were from Cork, the Honan family. Some of them came to Liverpool and lived on Princess Avenue They never married, lived there with his sister, who also never married. And by the time both of them died, there was a fairly substantial sum of money, in excess of equivalent of £1 million now, in their wills. So Tyson Smith was Velarde's sort of preferred sculptor. The mosaics behind, the sort of Byzantine mosaics behind, are a later addition, a bit like Bentley's Cathedral, really, which of course this is to a certain extent based upon. The church was finished in 1930, and to slightly mixed reviews. It was considered a sort of well-mannered and competent piece of Byzantine architecture with some good quality artwork. That has a very prominent tower with what Pevsner described as a rather embarrassing sort of copper cupola on the top of it with some little barley sugar columns. So it wasn't an unqualified success, but it was a good start and by no means a mean feat for a first church for a young architect. Now this, apologies for the graininess of the slide. It's the only picture I've got of Velarde and Charles Reilly together on the balcony of Embassy Court from 1934 in Brighton. And it's really important to make the point about, I think, Reilly's influence on Velarde and support of him was really critical in his early career. As I said, he was very much the father figure for Velarde, and I think he was something of Reilly's favourite. Reilly was always very supportive of his students, and some of the colleagues from Velarde's era would be people like Maxwell Fry and William Holford. So he was in illustrious company, but I think Reilly always had a bit of a soft spot for Velarde and would try and get him work where he could. And in fact, the next project, before we go on to the next project, another point about Velarde and Reilly is, and it comes back to that shot in Germany in 1928. In 1928, the pair of them travelled down through Germany, down through the Rhine to Stuttgart and possibly Nuremberg. We don't have their exact itinerary, but we know we went down there, and I know that Charles Reilly writes for the Manchester Guardian a series of articles at the beginning of the year tracking a journey through Germany. We also know that Velarde was there at exactly the same time because of the photographs and postcards that he has in the fragments of archive that we have got. And we know that they went to the Presser exhibition in Cologne. And around Cologne at the time, there were a large number of churches Catholic churches being designed and built by people like Dominicus Bohm and Martin Weber. And we think this has certainly had a powerful influence upon Velarde. They then went down to the Wiesenhofsiedlung, and it's curious that this perhaps is the point at which Reilly himself turns away from his American Beaux-Arts architecture, which he had favoured up until then, and becomes a firmer advocate of modernism, which we see then in his subsequent support for people like William Crabtree, another Liverpool graduate, with the store on Sloane Square in London. In Stuttgart, the Wiesenhofsiedlung was actually quite a provocative thing to do, not just stylistically. The fact that the Stuttgart school, the head of the Stuttgart school was Paul Bonnertz, who had just completed the train station, and he was an anti-modernist. And the great train station in Stuttgart, which is still there, has something of a church about it. It has a nave, and it has a brick or stone block massing and a great tower. And judging by the number of photographs in the archive, I think Velarde was more interested in Bonnertz's train station than he was in the Wiesenhofsiedlung. Bohm, not bomb, yes. Yes, my pronunciation is probably not very good for that. So here is Dominicus Bohm's sketch for Christ the King in Leverkusen, which is very close to Cologne, and would have been certainly on site when Reilly and Velarde went to visit the Presser exhibition in Cologne. some things to note here, because you will see this arising again and again in the work. The semi-detached campanile, the simple brick box with its pitched roof, and it's in this case the deep, really recessed semicircular opening, and then the small semicircular openings in the nave, and another Bohm sketch from the German Architecture Museum archive. These are impressive sketches. They're on sort of massive sheets of paper done in charcoal. And this is a speculative design, an unattributed design in terms of location for the inside of a church. And note both the high side aisles with their very tall brick arches and the multi-window array at the back. Now, whilst the trip down through the Rhine in 28 was really important for Velarde, and so, you know, he was still a young architect, it will have influenced him. It's important not to forget the local context. And right in the middle of Liverpool at the time, you had Giles Gilbert Scott's Anglican Cathedral going up. It's so sort of obvious in the city, you tend to forget about it. And Gilbert Scott was also teaching part-time at Liverpool School of Architecture, as was Velarde. And they will have certainly known each other. And this is Velarde's unplaced entry for the Guildford Cathedral competition in 1931. And you can see a certain influence of I think, of Gilbert Scott here, and also of Edward Morph's, I'm not quite sure the pronunciation, built scheme. The next commission that Velarde was to undertake, and this one is entirely on his own, St. Gabriel's, Blackburn. Now, this was his only Anglican commission, and it has been sadly greatly altered in the early 70s, to the extent that it was delisted. The best photographs of this are actually in the National Trust's Chambray-Hardman archive, and they show the interior in a beautiful mid-tone black and white photographs, and it's a very evocative, powerful space. Sadly, a lot of that power has now gone. The building is not in a great condition, and it suffers from subsidence. It was built on some infill, and in fact, the congregation have decamped into the church hall next door, I believe. It's hard really to envisage how powerful this church was in its original condition. The metal cladding panels are new. The church originally had parapets. Velarde hated downwater pipes, hated rainwater goods altogether, and he would go to great lengths to ensure that there were not rainwater goods on the principal elevations of his buildings. And so he hid all of this behind parapets, which of course leaked like a sieve after a while, especially with the subsidence. Here you can see you can just about make out the sort of confident brick massing, and but because it was an Anglican church, there wasn't the same scope for for large amounts of sort of figurative sculpture and saints and things internally. But that doesn't stop Velarde having a go at a few other things, and this sort of deco detailing takes over in the more restrained Anglican interior. And the lobby, this fantastic chromed lobby, which I think wouldn't look out of place in a 1930s hotel, and these sort of jazz modern doors. So this church I think its future is far from certain. It still has enough to commend it, I think, for people to try and save it, but it is certainly one to keep an eye on. Now, the next one was the church that made Velarde's reputation, St. Monica's Bootle, 1936. A large church in the northern suburb of Liverpool. And this was one that Reilly had not really had a hand in getting the commission for Velarde. He sort of got the commission for this one on his own merit, without Reilly's assistance. And it was described by Nicolas Pevsner on its completion as an epoch-making church for England. And he acknowledged the significant influence of Dominicus Bohm and German Catholic Church architecture in the period. And you can see the window arrays, certainly something that Velarde would use continually from here on in, have a strong association with Bourne. And there you can see in the great big west work, this massive slab of brickwork at the West End, liturgical West End, which is something that is also done in Rudolf Schwarz's St. Camillus at Mönchengladbach, which we suspect they may have also visited as it was on site again in 28 when they were in the Rhineland. Internally, one of the other things that makes this important and made Velarde important at the time as a church architect, and I think at this point he was, you know, he very nearly wasn't a singular architect. He was very nearly an architect who would be leading a new movement in church architecture. He was taking on board a lot of the lessons of the liturgical movement. And the liturgical movement was a sort of liberalizing movement within the Catholic Church in the first half of the 20th century. It predated that, but prominently in the first half of the 20th century, that sought to bring the congregation more into the experience of the Mass and make it a more integrated experience and less of a passive one. And this had several implications on church design, one of which was an attempt to try and bring the sanctuary closer into the nave and to reduce the impact of the altar rail and reduce the spatial separation, and to ensure clear sight lines from the nave to the altar. They also would eventually pull the altar away from the back wall so that the priest could turn around and face the congregation whilst celebrating Mass. By modern standards, hardly revolutionary, and certainly not as radical a shift as happened in the early 1960s with the Second Vatican Council. But at the time, it was for an organisation that's not known for its modernising tendencies, it was quite a step forward for the Catholic Church. And here you can see in the nave, very dark brickwork, very limited palette of materials, so as not to detract your eye from the very light, very white, very decorated altar. So there's no doubt about where the centre and focus is here. But notice there's virtually no chancel arch. There's virtually no spatial separation between the altar and the nave. And there you can see the altar area, highly decorated. Carving, not this time by Tyson Smith, although Tyson Smith did work on carvings for this church. These ones are by a sculptor called Stevenson. And whilst they're good, they lack the sort of the real delicate subtlety of line that Tyson Smith would bring to his work. The Stations of the Cross here are also by Stevenson in a very sort of sub-Eric Gill style. And there you can see those big, high, arched internal buttresses, moving the buttresses from the outside wall to the inside, and then puncturing them with the low side aisle. This has an interesting effect in that it puts the windows not in the nave but in the aisles. There's a small set of windows, there's a clerestory at the top of the nave, but they're fairly insignificant. This means that as the light is coming into the nave, you can't see the windows directly, so the light is always modulated by falling across the brickwork facades before it comes into the space, and it makes a subtler and more soft treatment of the main space. The light fittings are not original. The original light fittings sadly have gone, but pretty much everything else in this church is intact. It's grade 2 star listed, and it is certainly the one that's established Velarde's reputation beyond the sort of northwest region. One of the things he does to try and bring the sanctuary and the nave closer together is he moves the choir. And this is a big church, and so he moves the choir up into a choir gallery at first floor level over one of the side aisles. And on the left there, you can see the screen that separated the choir gallery from the sanctuary under construction. And the lack of, obviously, because this was an internal screen, not having to have any windows in it, meant that it had this very abstract quality, almost like a De Chirico composition. And his justification for moving the choir up there, because obviously the choir, I don't think the choir were terribly happy about being shunted up to a sort of attic on the side. They're not playing a major role in the in the front of the service anymore. But Velarde's thing was that the choir is there to lead the congregation, not to sing on its behalf. On the right is one of Velarde's little holy water stoops. It's this attention to detail that really comes across in the churches that Velarde was entirely involved with before his death. In this building, even the radiator covers are nice sort of chromed mantelpieces over the radiators. There are a lot of artists worked on this. The future Mrs. Holford, who was a Rome scholar in painting, did some very interesting painted glass, which is in one of the side aisles. And to protect it, it's a sort of double layer. There's glass painted on the inside and then another layer of glass stuck on top of that to protect it. So as I said, Tyson Smith was involved, Stevenson doing other sculptures, Marjorie Brooks, who would go on to become Mrs. Holford and was a lifelong friend and a Rome scholar. So it was full of artwork, and it still is, and it's very happily in good condition and very intact. At this point, Velarde's career was just, it was really just taking off. He had a client who was happy and supportive. He had a great mentor with Reilly. St. Monica's had received very good reviews and was seen as quite a progressive church. But then along came the Second World War, and so church building certainly stopped at that point. It wasn't an entirely empty period though for Velarde, because what I'm not going to dwell on in this lecture, because this is about his churches, but he also did a substantial number of Catholic schools, primary and secondary, and a couple of county schools as well, non-denominations. And these really paid the bills. The churches, he lavished so much time and attention on them that I'm sure he burnt up the fees several times over. So the schools were the kind of cash cow that kept the whole thing running. And this is Our Lady of Lourdes secondary school in Birkdale. It's still there. But it's still fairly close to being this as this photograph, although the windows have sadly changed. Completed in the middle of the Second World War, which is amazing. There was a lot of pressure to get this done because the little school that had been on the site, the primary school, was also being used to take evacuated children, and so was massively cramped. So they really did have to finish this. The slightly de la War Pavilion Staircase here is an interesting thing. It's not something you see that much in Velarde's work, but it's worth noting that he did actually enter the competition for the Bexhill-on-Sea Pavilion and was not placed. But I think it might have had more than a passing influence on this composition. The other point about this school, which is interesting, but you can't really see it from this photograph, it's the first time that he introduces mullions carved as angels. So angel mullions are something that you see, either angels or saints, quite often through Velarde's work. And so let's see here. Question there. Only a bit survives of the train station in Stuttgart, so sorry, it's not entirely there. But yes, Birkdale, which is a suburb of Southport in Merseyside. The primary school that was slightly earlier and was attached to that, what's now the school hall, was also served as a temporary chapel. And what I liked about this was it was only meant to be a church for a few years, although it took a lot longer to actually build the replacement, and Velarde didn't do the final parish church. But it's just the way he creates great effect with economy. There's really very little in here. It's essentially some timber boxes, but he just uses this semicircular motif repeatedly, and he has the little the very geometric candle holders to complement the tabernacle, and so it's all about economy, effective use of limited means in this temporary chapel. And I think you see that in a lot of other Velarde's later churches. Now, as the war was coming to an end, he had recovered from his bowel cancer. enough to take part in a conference in 1944 on the church and the artist. It was hosted by the Bishop of Chichester, who he had done this, who he designed this cross for, a little commemorative cross. 9 of these were made. They were carved by Tyson Smith to designs by Velarde. It's actually the identical motif to the one that Tyson Smith carved onto Velarde's tombstone or gravestone in Birkdale, in Southport. The conference must have been a bit of a rip-roaring affair. Velarde, there were 2 architects at the conference on church architecture and art, and where to go after the end of the Second World War. One was Edward Morph, and the other was Velarde. One obviously dealing with Anglican, and the other one with Catholic, I think was the intention. But some of the other people at the conference were quite interesting. You had T.S. Eliot, Dorothy Sayers, and Henry Moore. So it was quite a high-powered conference. And I'm just going to read this bit out because I think it's quite interesting about Velarde's character. So Eric McLagan, who was the director of the British Museum, had pointed out at the conference that about the importance of economy, that Wren had been often made to finish off his churches later when more funds became available. And so he was advocating some form of mass production as the answer to sort of post-war situation. Quite interesting position. Henry Moore was fairly uncompromising. His work was his own, and that was it. Take it or leave it. T.S. Eliot was thought that the characters should be like characters in a play, and they should be dramatic and but authentic. And the best one there was Dorothy Sayers, who said that the church had to address, and I'm quoting from the minutes of the conference here, the church had to address 3 levels of intelligence at once. 1, unspoilt children or peasants. 2, those of a Darwinian stage. Or 3, those who apprehended the modern physicist position. What a nice person. Velarde was not interested in this. His position was very much that, and he would write, he didn't write a great deal, but he would write after this, that he felt that the function of architecture was to combine tradition and creativeness, that these were not opposed, but are complementary and integral to each other. So he sort of knew where his position stood, and he wasn't going with the flow of the conference, but I don't think that really worried him. He was very much his own man, and just, I suppose, in the sense that Henry Moore said he did what he did, so did Velarde in a way. Now, after the war, he was extremely busy, and again, he writes in his diaries, which are full of references to food. He writes of being extremely busy but not building much. And Reilly sort of steps in again here. Now, by this point, this is Reilly's last great campaign. He's retired, long retired. He's really quite ill now, and in a nursing home. And he's fighting to promote his idea for new suburban housing developments based on what were called Reilly Greens. And this is a sort of village green arrangement with the houses all facing onto the village green and some communal buildings interspersed with allotments. And he'd tried this unsuccessfully in Birkenhead a couple of years earlier with the Woodchurch estate. And he'd lost that particular battle politically. And then this was taken up by the very progressive town clerk in Bilston in the West Midlands, who approached Reilly. And then Reilly effectively parcelled out large sections of this area of Bilston and Dudley to former students, of which one was Velarde, and this was Velarde's scheme. And this was curious. It was almost like Velarde being a student again. Reilly would make some suggestions. Velarde would do a drawing. He would return it to Reilly for comment. And only after he'd had the comments back from Reilly would he then amend it and send it to the client. Sadly, Reilly died before this scheme could really get enough momentum to it, and what was built bore no relationship to this. And I don't think Velarde was really that interested in pursuing housing. It wasn't where his heart lay. The schools paid the money and the churches were his passion. And after the war, the churches did eventually come through. The first few were effectively reworkings of army surplus from the war, Nissen huts and things, particularly in the Highton area of Liverpool, where there are a whole series of new parishes were created. And St Aloysius in Highton is not one of these temporary ones. It's still there. It's a substantial church in brick. Not a terribly typical Velarde church, but an intact one. But the first post-war one to really be significant in terms of Velarde's work was Our Lady of Pity in Greasby. And this would be a really important client. The parish priest here was Father Murphy, and he commissioned Velarde to start this project, and that was in, let's just get the dates right. The dates on here are generally the completion dates I've put in here. It was constructed between 51 and 52, but I think Murphy approached Velarde in the late 40s to start designing this. Velarde, one of Velarde's older brothers, was a parish priest at Bromborough on the Wirral. And so there were connections with the churches on the Wirral, which were in the Diocese of Shrewsbury. The Liverpool ones are all obviously in the Archdiocese of Liverpool. So you cross the Mersey and you cross into a different diocese. And Murphy would, before this church was complete, he would actually end up being elevated initially to Bishop of Shrewsbury and then eventually Archbishop of Cardiff, where he would have the epitaph of the builder, because Murphy loved commissioning churches and schools. And when he was Bishop of Shrewsbury, he would certainly commission an awful lot from Velarde. And this would be the busiest stream of new work for him. Now, Our Lady of Pity in Greasby is not a big church. It's by no means the smallest Velarde one, but it's not of the scale of the pre-war churches. And so what Velarde does effectively here is he brings a sense of scale and gravitas to really quite a small building. These big, muscular, semicircular arches down through the nave towards the altar, which they actually had to add some external buttresses to during construction because they were worried that they were starting to spread. Velarde tended to do his own structural calculations, not always very successfully. And this is a perennial problem with Velarde churches, is they tend to move around a little bit too much, which then upsets the parapet gutters, which then leak and cause all sorts of problems. But what you can see here is, again, the semi-detached campanile. So the big west works of St. Monica's are abandoned here, and he's gone back to the idea of the tower that he first used at St. Matthew Clubmoor. It's a fairly small building. So what he does is he makes the windows a little bit smaller than you'd expect. And in the nave, he places one array of windows above another array, which gives the illusion of it being a two-story high building when it's only a single-story high building. And then on the front, he links the campanile to the narthex and to the nave with this little arcade, just to try and bring a little bit of grandeur and formality to the entrance. Internally, again, you can see with very limited budgets, he's making the most of the altar and the polytech. No, I'll say triptych. It's not triptych. I can say triptych. I can't say polytech. Behind the altar, which was lost for a number of years and was recently restored. And again, the importance of paint. Velarde really, post-war, really discovers the importance of paint and how you can achieve quite dramatic effects very cheaply with paint, but you have to be very careful about how you use it. The next significant post-war church is really his largest and grandest of all Velarde's post-war churches, and is English Martyrs in Wallasey on the Wirral, again for the Diocese of Shrewsbury. And this is again recently been uplisted to Grade 2 star, and is again a very intact and beautiful building. The semi-detached campanile, now with the very typical Velarde detail of a kind of Portland stone or later concrete belfry and the copper cupola. You see this in various forms on most of Velarde's churches for the Diocese of Shrewsbury. No parapets here, but even without parapets, he's managed to sneak in a little hidden gutter to avoid downpipes on the main facade. The window arrangement to the nave I'm not sure quite how you would describe it. I don't think it really conforms to any particular school of thought. He's playing around with perhaps cross forms with the windows. He often distributes these small semicircular headed windows in different patterns, either 1/2 or 2/1 or 3/1, and here sort of 1/2/1. Internally, again, the brickwork, the importance and power of the brickwork. What I didn't mention on St. Monica's was he was very particular about not just the brickwork, but also the mortar. And on the pre-war churches, he tended to use 2-inch bricks, 50mm bricks, rather than the larger 65mm ones that we're used to. This gave it a slightly more European feel, which he then mixed with a very wide mortar joint in a matching mortar, so that the thing had a monolithic appearance. Sadly, on St. Monica's, most of it's been subsequently repointed in a lighter mortar, and you lose that monolithic character. After the war, he can't really afford these expensive 2-inch bricks, and you tend to get a more conventional use of brickwork. But he's still trying to get a monolithic feel to it. The big high side aisle arches, the internal buttresses of St. Monica's, have gone here, and he's gone back to the low semicircular side arches into the low side aisles, which we saw at St. Matthew's. One of the things in plan, and this is fairly typical of his larger churches where there was enough room to have side aisles, is the asymmetrical plan form. So one side aisle is larger than the other. When asked why he introduced this and some other sort of slightly random elements into his churches, he said he thought it would make God laugh. So he said he liked things to be just not perfect. They had to be slightly not perfect, because perfect wasn't quite right. It had to have a little thing that sort of threw you in it. And you can see here the painted ceiling, and which these decorative, very geometric decorative ceilings would become a Velarde hallmark. On the left, there is the altar detail with Christ and the apostles, and you notice on the far right of that one, Judas Iscariot is looking away, and although it's been slightly reduced in size with post-Vatican II reordering, the altar with its original base, again with Tyson Smith carving, and on the right the ambo, the lectern. Where he used metalwork, he tended to try and keep it fairly light, using flat steel, bent into curves or flat forms, still having that very 1930s sort of jazz modern Art Deco feel to it. And the altar rail, which is now gone, was in a similar vein. And again, because it's a large church, the choir gets shunted up into the first floor over one of the side aisles, and that's behind the screen on the left. And this beautifully detailed column, bringing these massive brick arches, down onto these decorative columns. And he has great fun playing with the detail of these columns on his post-war churches. The baptistery, which is near the entrance, has this lovely font in it with, again, Tyson Smith carvings, this time of angels chasing the devil around the font, and then fish scales on the top. And on the right, angels and saints as mullions, again a standard Velarde detail. You can always spot a Velarde church by the components like the campanile and copper cupola, or the angels as mullions, or the round-headed arrays of windows. A much smaller building, in fact his smallest church, no, it's not, actually that's not true. He did do some very small sort of Nissen hut type churches, but his smallest sort of substantial brick church, if that's not a contradiction, is St. Cuthbert by the Forest, which is his only totally rural church. It's in a straggling village on the Cheshire Plain, Nordsworth. And this is very, whilst there are elements here that are classic Velarde, in this case, fully detached campanile, with the copper pyramid on the top and the separate stone belfry. The brickwork with, again, the external buttresses to support the internal arches. This is very small. I think the congregation was designed for about 74 people, or 72 people. So. But if you look at the narthex there, the kind of west end with these double pitched roofs and the diamond windows, there's something of the arts and crafts about this, a little bit of the feel of a Letheby building about it. So again, very much reinterpreting traditional English church forms. The interior fittings on here, this was built on such a small budget. It was, I think, £7,000 when it was built, and an extra 1,000 for the campanile, which was added at the end. All the fittings were donated from other sources and were by Velarde. He did a couple of churches in Shrewsbury itself, or suburbs of Shrewsbury, St Winfred, and was the early one and was the one that was entirely built by him and completed by him, rather. And again, similar scale to Our Lady of Pity in Greasby, the external brick arches, and there again you can see the single window over the double window and the nave. And if you compare that to the front door, you can see the door tells you the real scale, but the other one makes you, the windows in the nave make you think it's a two-story building when it's not. And again, a classic detached, semi-detached campanile and angels as mullions. And larger one, and again, a very beautiful, this is the church, St. Teresa at Upholland. This is the church that first alerted the C20 Society and Heritage England really to Velarde's work. Upholland, there was a big Catholic seminary at Upholland, which only closed a few years ago. And Velarde certainly gave lecture there, and so he was known, and he was obviously known in the Archdiocese of Liverpool, which this falls within. And here again, you can see the classic semi-detached campanile. There are rainwater goods on this one, which is untypical of him. And internally, though, the painted ceilings and the elaborated columns supporting the low brick arches to the, in this case, only one side aisle, the low side aisle, which ends in a small lady chapel. Mosaics. Now, this is the church at which mosaics really start to appear in Velarde's work, and they would go on and become more important as his work progressed. And there's the gold mosaics. He loved gold and blue, gold and blue, the way they work together. Apparently he used to carry some gold leaf around in his pocket because he just loved the luster of it and the opulence of it. His wife thought, Madge thought this was crass and tacky, did not approve. And there's the lovely but very diminutive Lady Chapel. There was an anomaly. Well, there were quite a few anomalies. There always are. There's always exceptions to every rule. And this is the Thanksgiving Shrine of Our Lady of Lourdes in I should say Blackpool, not Blackburn. Sorry about that. I have to correct that one. Built on the outskirts of Blackpool for the Diocese of Lancaster as a thanksgiving for the limited amount of bomb damage that the diocese suffered in the Second World War. And the budgets for this were much higher, and so he departed from his normal brickwork, and instead it's all in ashlar Portland stone, and a very nice expensive copper roof over the whole of the church rather than the sort of plain tiles that we normally see. When this was being built, underneath there's an undersheathing below that roof of a beautifully finished pitch pine boarding. And when when he was putting the boarding on, one of the sculptors who worked on this had a conversation with Velarde. He said, "Well, why are you spending so much time on this timber undersheathing? It's all going to be covered up. No one's ever going to see it." And Velarde's response was, "Ah, yes, but just remember the thought of it." So it was, always these little sort of quirks of his nature. So the budget was big here, so he didn't have to really skimp on stuff, and he certainly didn't on the roof or on the carving. Now this is the large carving on the west end, done in situ, as you can see. Thank you to Robin Reilly for the photograph on the right. And Robin Reilly is the sculptor. I think he's bottom right in that photograph. And he was one of the assistants working with David John. Now David John was a new sculptor and of religious art, who Velarde liked to think he discovered. He was certainly one of the first to use him, and he used him extensively in later years, primarily because Tyson Smith was busy and Velarde was designing lots of churches, so couldn't get him to do everything. And Velarde was slightly disparaging. He said he questioned David John's artistic sensibilities, but he said he was technically a very good sculptor. So that so long as he followed instructions, he was very happy with his work. And again, Robin Reilly recounts Velarde saying, "I want, if you do it something like this," and doing a sketch, which of course meant do it exactly like this. And internally there, the gold mosaics are reappearing, but render rather and plaster rather than the brickwork. But it's still the blue and the gold in the ceiling, and again the steel flats for the very elegant and very lightweight altar rails. The last church Velarde completed in the northwest entirely before he died was Holy Cross in Bidston, which opened in 1959. And Bidston is a suburb of Birkenhead. And this takes on a completely different form, and he brings in travertine and strange fluted plasterwork internally. So he's trying out new stuff with this one. He's still got the typical blue and gold ceilings and lots of mosaics. But the plan has this apsoidal sort of basilican end to it, with an ambulatory that runs around the back, that the side aisles extend in an ambulatory around the back of the altar, which is raised up on a freestanding platform. Very different plan type, although the side aisles are still asymmetrical, and there is still a semi-detached campanile with a copper top and a stone belfry. You can see that on the left. We think there's a little bit of influence here, perhaps, from an architect called Ernst Wiesner. He was a Czech architect, a prominent modernist in the 1930s, who fled Czechoslovakia in the Second World War, and eventually, after various journeys, settled in Liverpool, where he got a job at the School of Architecture, and converted from Judaism to Roman Catholicism, and was friends with the Archbishop of Liverpool. And so he would have certainly had a lot in common with Velarde. They were teaching together. They were both of the same faith, and they both had similar interests. Wiesner didn't design churches. He designed a couple of schools in Liverpool, one of which, St. Nicholas Primary School, is still there, and it's an interesting sort of brutalist composition. But before the war, he designed a crematorium in Brno in the Czech Republic. That's now the Czech Republic. And it has these same little slender stone finials with these elongated pyramidal caps to them. And there's certainly a marked similarity there. So to what extent Velarde was being influenced by other people coming into the School of Architecture, not entirely certain, but we suspect there was certainly some impact there. You can see on the plan there the Lady Chapel, which is turned at 90 degrees to the body of the nave and tucked in at the side. This is something that Velarde would then repeat in some of his later, or in some of the contemporary with this, London churches. And there on the left, you can see the altar area at the opening, with those classic multi-window arrays in the style of Dominicus Bohm. And on the right, the very beautiful mosaics in the Lady Chapel. And the Lady Chapel is completely covered in that blue and gold mosaic pattern, and this is the focal point over the altar in the Lady Chapel. This church is empty. It is boarded up. The Diocese of Shrewsbury are looking after it. They're maintaining it. It is listed, and they are, I think, hoping to find a suitable use for it. But it has to be a significant piece of work, of Velarde's work, that's endangered, and we would hope that a suitable user can be found for this building. The mosaics were by Carters of Poole. And this is the lobby area, the narthex and the entrance lobby, and beyond the baptistery. And he's really having fun with these mosaics here. Instead of paint, geometric patterns. There's almost something postmodern, there's a sort of slightly Sotsas type of detailing going on here. Obviously not the debris, but the mosaics. The London churches came, and we're getting towards the end now. The London churches came towards the end of Velarde's career, and the Archbishop of London at the time, Godfrey, was quite conservative, but had been an Archbishop at Liverpool previously, so he knew Velarde, and he knew that Velarde was a fairly safe pair of hands. The first building that Velarde did in London was not actually a church at all. It was a chapel for an ecumenical women's organisation called the Grail, and it was at the Waxwell farmhouse in Pinner, in northwest London. Externally, it's a simple brick building, but internally, he's making the most of a very limited budget and opportunity here for a small chapel attached to this ecumenical community. And the gold and the blue of the ceiling, using paint to maximum effect, and then accentuating it. I suppose it's the good old-fashioned thing of, a few good quality accessories can really lift an outfit, and he's doing that here with the altar and the tabernacle and the various fittings around the altar itself, and the support for the tabernacle is amazing. There, it's like sort of 3 javelins stuck in the ground, and the beautiful little fish motif. And again, these small little accents are used to lift what is essentially a very simple and cheap interior. Gold mosaics, some gold mosaic crosses on the floor, and again a multi-array window. Shortly after that, and just down the road in Pinner, he completed his largest and most impressive of his London churches, St. Luke's in Pinner. And you can see again those classic multi-window arrays. The window, the heaters are a later addition. He tended to use underfloor heating, and it absolutely failed every single time. So all the churches have had to retrofit some other heating systems because of the failure of the underfloor heating. So sadly, these sort of space heaters don't really respect the window pattern too much. And again, the gold mosaic columns, and here the brickwork curiously is painted white, very sort of Scandinavian, really. And the only reason really I think for departing from the fair-faced brickwork that he had used up until now internally was to set a counterpoint to this amazing geometric nave and rear wall of the sanctuary, where one carries down to the other and sort of blurs the boundary between the 2 spaces. The chancel arch between the nave and the sanctuary is little more than 2 projections in the side walls. There's no interruption even on the ceiling plane. So the sanctuary feels very much part of the main space. And again, the low side aisles with the semicircular arches. Sorry, Archbishop of Westminster, not London. Sorry, yes, wrong denomination. In the London churches, though, he returns to the Westworks, the great big blocks of masonry that we saw at St. Monica's in Bootle, with nothing to articulate it other than his very typical hardwood doors with their projecting diamond patterns, and some large sculptures carved again by David John. This is perhaps the most Germanic in feel of his Westworks. And internally, again, a very simple and effective lady chapel, in this case just inside the main entrance rather than at the east end. And the tabernacle, again, he designed a series of really quite beautiful tabernacles for his churches. The next most significant church that he designed in London was St. Teresa of Child Jesus in Boreham Wood. This was completed after his death. Velarde died in 1960, and this was completed by the principal in the office who had been working under Velarde, undertook to complete all of his churches that were on site at the time in the style and in the manner to which Velarde would have wanted. And the main people there were Richard O'Mahony, who was a young graduate out of Liverpool School of Architecture, hadn't been in the practice long. Julian Velarde, FX's eldest son, who would stay with the practice for a few years before marrying and moving to London. And Janet Nospelius, who I mentioned right back at the beginning as the formidable lady who accosted me in the staircase. She was actually as a child, was the model for Arthur Ransom's character Nancy in Swallows and Amazons. Her mother, Arthur Ransom, had been in love with her mother and had proposed to her. She had turned him down, but they'd stayed friends. And she was an absolute natural pedant. She was notorious in the office for getting her red pen out and correcting spelling and grammar in letters. But she was incredibly loyal and stayed with Velarde and effectively ran the office really from about 1950 through to Velarde's death in 60. And she completed, she was one of the people responsible for completing the churches in the style that Velarde would have liked. And here you can see in the foreground is the Lady Chapel. Again, as with Holy Cross, turned through 90 degrees and off one of the side aisles adjacent to the sanctuary with a nice little top light over it. This was designed, and this one was designed so that the seating could flip either way, so that the side Lady Chapel could also be an overspill chapel for the main church. And so Giles Velarde actually worked on the details of the Lady Chapel here and designed the seating so that it could flip backwards and forwards, which is what the seating on the overhead railway used to do in Liverpool. And the last of these, this series of churches in London that were completed by others was St Edmund of Canterbury, which is, it's much more of a sort of compromised composition. It's not quite got the full-blown Velarde feel to it. Interesting because there's a very early artwork, metal screen in here by Norman Dilworth, the sculptor, modernist sculptor. But that was the last of the Velarde sort of postscript churches. Oh, sorry, no, I forgot. Well, completed slightly before that, but now demolished. St Vincent de Paul and Louise de Mirillac in Potter's Bar. This church had several names, but was demolished and is now being replaced by, I think, the third church on that site. But again, the classic Velarde, detached campanile, but right. Someone saying that yes, it's that the St Edmund of Canterbury is unlisted and not as good as St Luke's, but it still has a lot of qualities in its own right. So that takes us really to Velarde's death, or in fact it takes us after his death, but with postscript churches. But with his death at the end of 1960, the practice really lost its momentum. It continued for a few years as the F X Velarde partnership, and then it mutated as the new generation took it over, and Richard O'Mahony and others produced spectacular churches such as St Michael All Angels at Wood Church on the Wirral, which is what brought me to Velarde in the first place. So in terms of the body of this, I'll just finish with a nice quote from FX's obituary by his lifelong friend Herbert Fell. He's talking about the churches. The local ones, beginning in 1927 with St Matthew's at Clubmoor and ending with Holy Cross in Birkenhead, 1959. Not only brighten the drab parts in which they are to be found, but serve to make both spiritually and architecturally aware those who visit. That's a nice little observation. So, the legacy: painted ceilings, altars, fonts, carved angels, furniture, altarware. He often designed all the altarware. These very postmodern candelabra are, I believe, not liked by the priests because they're extremely difficult to hold. But again, they're very typical of Velarde's churches. and angels, gold angels, everywhere gold angels. And finally, to finish with the plug for the book. So there is the book, which is due out on the 31st of October. So there's most of the images that are in this lecture are in the book, and a great deal more. So please buy it. Thank you. I think there's one more comment there in the chat. I'll just see who. Oh, sorry, yes, the Boreham Wood one. Yes, yeah, Boreham Wood is impressive. Saint Teresa of the Child Jesus still had, although it's had a lot of additions to it, internally, it's got lots of extra accretions that you normally get with Catholic churches. The essence of the church is still intact, and it is a decent church, although we're not listed. Thank you. Shall I stop the screen share?
Yes. Unless you want to remind people to buy the book, leave it up there. Thank you ever so much.
Slightly overran, sorry.
No, not significantly. And it was a real joy to see all those wonderful images and to hear about his career. I really hope that at some point soon we'll be able to have a 20th century trip to see some of those churches, maybe both a northwest trip and a London trip. I mean, it's a real kind of attention to detail and just making the most out of very simple materials in many cases, isn't it? Or out of.
I mean, by the time he died in 1960, I mean, he did enter the competition for the Catholic Cathedral. He was pressured to enter it, just as he'd been pressured to take over the completion of Lutyens' scheme, which he declined.
For the Liverpool Roman Catholic Cathedral, yeah?
The Liverpool Roman Catholic Cathedral, yeah. So he declined taking over completing Lutyens' scheme after the war, quite sensibly, I think. And he did enter the 1959-1960 competition for the Catholic Cathedral that was won by Gibbard. He was very ill at that point, and so the drawings, although they were technically very good in terms of the layout, it was passed over and didn't get anywhere. So that was never going to be his legacy, the Catholic Cathedral. But the point was that by then he was sort of slightly out of time, because that was the cusp of Vatican II, and a whole new generation were coming through, and his architecture had kind of run its course, I think, in many ways.
We've got a few questions. Did he design any pipe organ cases, facades, as part of his schemes?
Not that I'm aware of.
Any organs? Do the churches have organs? You must have organs.
Some of them do. They tend to be ones that are brought in. They're often salvaged from other churches and dumped on the poor unsuspecting parish.
And I'm just checking.
I mean, in fact, in Pinner, I don't know whether he might have done in Pinner, because the parish priest in Pinner, Father Trotman, said right early on that he would refuse to allow any sort of standard Catholic artwork to be dumped in the church. That everything had to be approved by the architect in terms of the fittings of St. Luke's and Pinner. He wanted a total piece of work. So I'm not sure whether he did in Pinner.
Right. I mean, and a lot of the churches seem to have maintained all their artworks intact to this day. I mean, it does seem a lot of the places that you were showing us that we're still getting the full set of Stations of the Cross and all those altar fit furniture.
I'm just looking at some of these questions. The Chambray Hardman photo. Someone's asked if the Chambray Hardman photographs. So St. Gabriel's is in Blackburn. The Chambray Hardman photographs actually are available online. You can view them on the National Trust Chambray Hardman website. You have to trawl through a lot of portraiture, but they are there, buried in about 2/3 of the way through. And they give you an idea of what was originally a very impressive interior and exterior to the church. I didn't use them in the talk because it takes quite a long time to get copyright permission to use them. So they're in the book, but they're not in the talk, I'm afraid.
Okay, and what about the question about whether there are any links or comparisons with Plečnik?
Would he have known about Plečnik? I don't know. He was certainly influenced by the Poles, because Liverpool had the Polish School of Architecture came to Liverpool University in the 1940s, when Fredwell under Captain Torren. And certainly, obviously, I think there was a connection with Wiesner and Czechoslovakia. He wasn't particularly actively seeking out overseas influences. I think that they came to him by virtue of where he went. Most of his journeys, I don't think he ever went down to the former Yugoslavia. Most of his holiday journeys tended to be in France and Spain.
Right.
He felt a sort of natural drawing to Spain because of the Spanish ancestry with the Velarde name. And he's got some great sketchbooks from that period, including a beautiful sketch of Cardinal Roncalli, who went on to become a pope, and he's drawn him front and back elevation doing mass, which is quite funny. But I don't think he ever went. I doubt he would have been a rare Plechnik particularly.
Yeah. Yeah. And he did go and look at a lot of modernist architecture, didn't he, on some of those trips? I mean, you showed us him.
Yes. He certainly did. But I think he was more drawn to the expressionist stuff. I mean, he went to see Notre Dame de Rancy, the great concrete church in the outskirts of Paris. And he liked the layout, but he was not a fan of concrete.
Right.
He never particularly liked concrete as a material. He had to use it occasionally, for obvious structural reasons, but generally he preferred brickwork. So most of those brick arches are genuinely load-bearing arches. And I think someone has said they have the stress calculations for the sanctuary arch at English Martyrs in their archive. Somewhere I think I've got his second year architecture structural engineering exam results. He wasn't brilliant at it, but having done it at university, he thought he could do it, and it did give a few problems.
So he didn't work with an engineer in most cases?
Well, he would have done on the larger churches, but he generally, I think he put a lot of the first stuff went together on his own calculations. But he would have worked with engineers on the bigger ones. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I think we should wrap up, but thank you very, very much. Maybe I should just ask you to finish by saying, do you feel you've learnt anything from writing the book that you will apply to your own architectural practice? An impossible question. I've been wondering as you've been talking.
My personal design sympathies are far more brutalist.
Yeah, well, that's why it's kind of an interesting topic for you to have picked. Yeah,
it's fascinating. It's a fascinating digression from what I thought I would be doing at this point in my life.
So, do you recommend writing a monograph then for other architects?
Yeah. Just don't expect to do it in less than 5 years. Not if you've got a full-time job doing other things.
Yeah. No, well, we're really grateful. I'm sure it's a great read, and obviously a real labour of love. And I hope that it will have a really strong role in actually helping us to ensure the long-term future of some of these amazing buildings. Yeah,
the one that we really need to keep an eye on is Holy Cross Bidston, because the mosaics by Carter in there are spectacular, and it's still, although it's knocked around a lot, it's still intact, and the diocese have so far managed to keep the local youths out, but for how much longer we're not sure. Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, thanks very much for that.
Thank you from Winnipeg. Oh, we've got Canadian viewers as well. Wow, great! That's the international nature of the crowd.
Yes, yeah. No, I mean, that is the upside of doing this. And just before I sign off, let me remind you that we have got a talk on photographs talk on Sunday, Joshua Mardell on Tuesday, and then next Thursday we start our autumn lecture series, which is going to be 6 individual talks on places of worship, and the details of all of those are on the website. So I hope some more of you will be able to join us again. Okay, and so thanks ever so much, Dominic.
Okay.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for spending your evening listening to me rather than having a glass of wine.
Well, I'm sure some people did both.
Well, that's of course, yes, you can do that with these.
Yeah, you can.
Yes, I keep forgetting Zoom is you can multitask. I couldn't have a glass of wine, so I'm going to now.
Enjoy it. I'm sorry we can't take you out for dinner. Bye-bye.